Sultanate stood in front of the Orkhon inscriptions in the depths of Asia, under the endless blue sky. Next to her, 4 shamans sang 91 hymns to their sky god, directed by their master, Jem. Sultanate's mind was on other matters. Her cousin Engin had begun a long journey with his tribe westward in search of a new home, while her sister Bilge was on her horse trying to reach the Black Sea. Sultanate raised her drum and began to pray a hymn to Tengri to help her brethren reach their new homes. This fictional story shows us the importance the ancient Turkic and Mongolic people placed on Tengriism, an umbrella term for the ancient animistic religion of the nomads of the eastern steppe. A faith often crudely stereotyped as primitive, Tengriism is anything but. A sophisticated form of spirituality with a rich history, it has played an important role in Turkic history from the first accounts of Turkic peoples under the Gokturks all the way to the medieval age. Welcome to our introductory video on the religion of Tengriism and its role in early Turkic history. Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? Because they get history you won't find anywhere else. We release 3 new exclusive videos every week. Plus, they get perks like early access to all videos, voting rights on upcoming series and videos, access to our private Discord, our production schedule, and much more. Right now, 250 exclusive episodes are waiting for members and patrons, including from our series on the Eastern Front of World War II, Spanish War of Succession, the Punic Wars, the Pacific War, the Iberian Reconquista, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and Carthaginians, and many others. By joining, you're not only unlocking rare content, you're also supporting the stories you love. Your help allows us to keep producing 3 free videos per week while paying our team competitive salaries and growing the channel. Join via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Thanks for making this possible. The origins of Tengriism are challenging to decipher due to the lack of sources from Turkic and Mongolic peoples from before the 8th century CE. The most prominent form of Tengriism in the historical record is the form practiced during the time of the Mongol Empire in the 1200s CE, due to the extensive number of literate civilizations writing about the Mongols during this era for obvious reasons. However, it would be wrong to assume that the Tengriism practiced by Genghis Khan and his successors was identical to the Tengriism practiced by Turkic and Mongolic peoples in previous centuries. In addition to its murky origins, our understanding of Tengriism is also hindered by the misconception that it was a form of shamanism, an umbrella term in which spiritual experts called shamans communicate with the spirit world. This is not fully correct, as we know from archaeological excavations in Kazakhstan and Siberia that Tengriist practices were not practiced exclusively by spiritual experts, but by average members of the tribe. From this it can be surmised that shamans were part of Tengriist religious life, but not the absolute arbiters of the faith. Shamans should be seen as professionals who were consulted for specific purposes, like fortune-telling and dealing with illnesses. During periods where Tengriist nomads controlled large empires, the most important intermediary with the spiritual was the Khan himself. However, despite the misconceptions surrounding Tengriism and gaps in the record of its development, a general statement can be made that the early Turkic and Mongolic peoples did practice an umbrella of beliefs that were connected to a deity known as Tengri or the eternal blue sky. The earliest concrete evidence for Tengriism comes from perhaps the oldest inscriptions related to the Turkic peoples. These are the Orkhon inscriptions, named after the valley in Mongolia in which they were found. Many different inscriptions relating to different topics are found on the stone. In one of its sections, dated to approximately 865 CE, a leader known as Bilge Khagan extols his exploits and his divine lineage to Tengri. The deity is mentioned throughout the inscriptions, in passages such as this: "When the blue sky above and the dark earth below were made, then were made between them both the sons of men. Over the sons of men set themselves as rulers my forebears, Bumin Khagan and Estemi Khagan. And having set themselves as rulers, they governed and kept in order the Turkish people's kingdoms and polity. All the peoples in the 4 quarters of the world were foes to them, but they waged wars against them, and overcame all the peoples in the 4 quarters of the world, made them keep the peace, and bowed their heads, and bent their knees. Towards the east, they made them settle as far as the mountain forest of Kadakan, to the west as far as Tamir Kapig. Over so great a distance did they rule between these 2 extremes, bringing order to the Gokturks, who were without lord and without any tribal organization. This inscription firmly establishes a divine connection between the Khagan and sky god Tengri, providing him with divine legitimacy to rule. This inscription also suggests that the blessings of Tengri were considered essential for good governance in the eyes of the early Turkic people. The connection between ruling Khans and the eternal blue sky is a concept that continued among succeeding Turkic and Mongolic dynasties until their conversion to various forms of Christianity, Islam and Buddhism. Tengriism was incorporated into the royal titles of many Turkic and Mongolic states. The rulers of the Uyghur Khaganate in the 8th to 9th centuries CE were particularly fond of this sort of divine titulature. Titles for their Khans included Tengri Khagan and Tengri Ilik, meaning my heaven/god and heaven prince respectively. Little else can be surmised from the late antique period of Turkic and Mongolic history. We have evidence from archaeological excavations of small statuettes being used in household religious rituals, likely linked to fertility, family, and for controlling forest spirits to protect one's sacred land. Little more information can be surmised from ancient findings, but it does appear that the old Turkic beliefs we know as Tengriism were cosmologically and ritually rich. We will now move on to the mythology of Tengriism, particularly its deities and supernatural conception of the world. Unpacking the early Turk-Mongolic cosmology is a difficult task. In general, the center of the cosmos in Tengriism is the sky deity known as Kuk Tengri, and later as Komusta Tengri. Tengri has been described by historians as a supreme deity, like the father god of a polytheistic pantheon, or as the manifestation of the blue sky itself. Some have even described Tengri as a monotheistic god, much like Ahura Mazda in the Zoroastrian faith or the god of the Abrahamic religions. The latter view was mainly perpetuated by medieval historians of Christian and Muslim persuasion, who sought to relate Tengriism to their faiths, and is questioned by many modern scholars. In the Turkic mythological worldview, Kuk Tengri controls the blue sky, under which the Proto-Turks roamed the steppes, and from whom Khans claimed legitimacy in order to rule. In some regional variations of Tengriism, Tengri has a spouse named Umay, who is responsible for fertility and well-being. In the Mongol versions of the myth, Tengri's wife is named Nechigai Eke, or the Earth Mother. Little else is known about her, but some modern Turkic tribes, like the Kakas of Siberia, associate birch trees with her as connections to heaven. Many other deities and spirits exist in modern Turkic myths, such as the creator deity Akana, who is related to water, or the fire deity Otata. As should be expected of cultures for whom the horse was so central to their way of life, the Turks and Mongols placed particular emphasis on deities related to equestrian matters. For instance, they worshipped a deity known as Dayasut Tengri, a war god. Dayasut Tengri shared a name with the sky god Tengri because he was considered to be in the highest class of supernatural beings. He is always shown mounted on a horse, and continues to be revered even after many Mongol tribes adopted Tibetan Buddhism from the 17th century onwards. Turkic and Mongolic mythologies often place emphasis on naturalistic elements. Indeed, for many modern-day Turkic tribes that still practice parts of Tengriism, the animal and human worlds are not so neatly divided as they are in the Western worldview. The most famous example of this is the myth of the blue wolf. In this myth, a human and a wolf procreate, and produce the progenitors of the many Turkic tribes that existed in antiquity. The human involved in this union may be a man or a woman, depending on the Turkic group telling the story. The most famous version of this myth is that in which the she-wolf Asena finds a boy who survived a battle and nurses him back to health. The young man then impregnates her, and she then gives birth to 10 half-men, half-wolves who then founded the 10 tribes of the famous Gokturk Confederacy, which dominated the Eurasian steppe from the 6th to 8th centuries. This myth likely emerged in order to justify the reign of the ruling Gokturk elites amongst their tribal brethren. Chinggis Khan of the Mongol Empire also utilized the wolf myth to legitimize his rule, claiming a blue wolf named Kukachino and a fallow doe, or Goa Mural, as ancestors. In addition, the Turks and Mongols also worshipped their ancestors in household shrines, and at least at the royal level, said ancestors were deified. Their ancestors were prayed to for help in their everyday lives. Whether someone was smashing the cup of happiness in front of their love in the Volga River, or writing a letter to their love by the shores of the Crimean Peninsula, they always hoped their ancestors would guide them to a good life. As the second millennium CE began to dawn, the beliefs of Tengriism evolved in accordance with the political agendas that dominated the greatest land empire in world history, that of the Mongols. This empire, founded at the dawn of the 13th century CE, famously became the largest contiguous land empire in world history, spanning from the depths of southern China to the steppes of southern Russia. Much like his Turko-Mongol predecessors, Genghis Khan utilized his divine connections to Tengri to justify his rule as overlord of the Mongols, and Tengriism remained a major part of Mongol ideology for many of the dynasties of his successors. Our understanding of Tengriism during this period is much richer than earlier periods, due to the density of written records about the Mongol Empire. However, it is also more coloured by the perceptions of the Christian, Muslim and Buddhist writers who wrote those records. Modern scholars, like the late Jagdalin Bira, claim that during the rule of the Mongol Empire, Tengriism was transformed from the ethno-religion of the Turkic and Mongol peoples into a universal faith, whose role was to justify the rule of this vast empire and its successors. Consequently, Tengri became a universal deity, whose control over the sky gave the Mongols the right to control the whole world. The Khan was made to be an incarnation of Tengri himself, and thus to be a source of power and imperial control over his realm. Tengriism was an imperial cult, but one that was religiously tolerant. For instance, many ethnic Mongolian factions within the Mongol Empire were not Tengriists. The Kariids in particular were Christians. This Tengriist royal ideology could easily tie itself to whatever religious tradition was present in any given region conquered by the Mongols. In the Mongol-ruled Yuan dynasty of China, Tengriism interacted with Buddhist ideals of kingship, such as the idea of the universal wheel-turning monarch. Yuan Mongol rulers, such as Kublai Khan, found no trouble practicing both Tibetan forms of Buddhism and using Tengriism in proclamations to assert themselves as universal rulers. The Mongol elite also used Tengri in their diplomatic correspondence. The 1246 letter of Gokturk Khan, sent to Pope Innocent IV, bears invocations to eternal Tengri in both Mongolian and Turkic, demanding the submission of the Catholic Church. In 1262, Hulagu Khan of the Mongol Ilkhanate sent a letter to King Louis IX of France. In this letter, Hulagu claims that he had treated the Christians in his realm with respect, in an attempt to secure an alliance with the Catholic states of Europe against the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The letter to King Louis presented Hulagu as a campaigner against Saracens, who fought in the name of eternal Tengri, which the letter's Latin translator rendered as the living God. This correspondence suggests that Tengriism was an important part of how Mongols demonstrated their authority to monotheistic states. Many Mongol rulers came into contact with Christianity, Buddhism, Manichaeism, and Islam through intermarriages within their own families. Thus, this increasing emphasis on a more monotheistic presentation of Tengriism was likely driven by both foreign influences as well as political expediency in communicating with other states. Ultimately, Tengriism of the Mongol Empire and its successors was profoundly impacted by 13th century Mongol imperialism, becoming a more unitary religion used to promote the interests of the elite. The 13th century saw both the apex and the beginnings of the decline of Tengriism as a major world religion. During this period, the Mongols and Turks of various states had begun to convert to other faiths, such as Islam and Buddhism. This is too broad a topic to cover in one video, but we will provide some illustrative examples of how it unfolded. In the case of Islam, many scholars have made the case that the Turkic tribes that converted to the faith did so through Sufis, groups of Islamic mystics whose practices sometimes resembled those of Tengriist shamans. This theory was originally proposed to explain the conversion of the Turks and Mongols in the Ilkhanate in the 14th century CE. However, the similarities between Sufi mystics and Tengriist shamans are overstated, as was their role in converting the Turks and Mongols to Islam. In fact, many scholars today think this was a myth spread by the Sufis themselves in the 15th century to boost their legitimacy, and most of the conversion legwork was done by Muslim jurists in West Asia. Turkic and Mongol conversions to Islam were not a straightforward or even process. For instance, an initial conversion of the Mongol Ilkhanate elite to Islam was temporarily reversed by Khan Aghan. Aghan was not an opponent of the Islamic faith, as he kept many Muslim officials in his court. However, it appears that he may have represented a faction of elites who saw conversion as politically problematic. Nevertheless, the overall historical trend of the Turkic and Mongolian dynasties that ruled over Persia and the Middle East was one of conversion to Islam. With regards to Buddhism, the story is somewhat different. Buddhism is a more flexible religion than Christianity or Islam, in that it recognizes the existence of deities and spirits from other religions. Buddhism's main tactic when it spread into a new area was the process of domestication, which involved incorporating local spirits and deities into the Buddhist pantheon of bodhisattvas and other spirits. These spirits and some of their rituals were then used inside a Buddhist setting. A form of this process manifested itself in Mongolia proper, where the Mongols became engrossed in the Vajrayana form of Buddhism found in Tibet. The conversion to Buddhism in the heartland of the Mongol people gained momentum in the 16th century CE. Mongol rulers such as Altan Khan forged official alliances with the 3rd Dalai Lama of Tibet and began to use Buddhism to assert their authority. The Dalai Lama was the head of the Gelug Buddhist school in Tibet, which was on the rise as a political power at the time. It was in fact Altan Khan who first gave the title of Dalai Lama to the 3rd Dalai Lama, who then retroactively assigned it to his 2 predecessors. Armed with propagation and conversion skills, Buddhist monks from Tibet spent much of the 17th century roaming across Mongolia, where they began to take over some of the roles of local shamans in matters such as medicine and divination. Many deities and spirits worshipped in Tengriism, such as Tenri Bogu, became deities in Buddhism. State-led purges of Tengriism by Buddhist rulers also happened in Mongolia and often turned quite violent. Thus, by the 17th and 18th centuries, Buddhism had taken Tengriism under its umbrella. Seeking through faith to reach the truth, the Mongols became a stronghold of Buddhism in Inner Asia. With the shift of the Turks and Mongols towards Islam, Buddhism and Christianity, Tengriism became a marginal faith in Central Asia and the Middle East. Many Turkic and Mongolic tribes in the remote far north of Siberia continued to practice forms of the faith, such as the Sakha people in the modern-day Sakha Republic of Russia. Their beliefs, recorded as shamanic by early Russian colonists and anthropologists, survived into the 19th century, and even beyond, despite attempts at conversion to Orthodox Christianity by the Russian Empire. The state atheism of the Soviet Union in the 20th century also had a negative impact on these Tengriist peoples, but the faiths of the Siberian people have survived in a weakened form to this day. In Mongolia and its neighbours of Buryatia and Tuva, embers of Tengriism survived into the 20th century and were repressed under the communist regime until the transition to capitalism in the early 1990s. In Central and West Asia, the story is more complicated. In Turkey, the rise of Turkish nationalism in the early 20th century resulted in attempts to reassert their connections to Tengriist myths, like that of the she-wolf Asena, to dislodge the Turkish identity from the influence of Islam and the Middle East. Turkish nationalism ended up using this mythology in a secular setting to build a national ideology that replaced the Ottoman Turkish identity after the Turkish War of Independence. Tengriism itself was not revived as a religion, but the visual imagery of wolves remains prominent in Turkish nationalist circles to this day. In Central Asia and the Volga region, the dominance of Islam and later the state atheism of the USSR left little space for Tengriism. The fall of communism in 1989 resulted in some Central Asian intellectuals using Tengriism not as a religious revivalist movement, but as an attempt to assert an identity independent from that of the former Soviet Union and modern-day Russia. As of the 21st century, there have even been some small revivalist movements of Tengriism, although these have not achieved widespread success. The exception to this rule is the revival of the faith amongst some Siberian indigenous groups, as well as the Republic of Tatarstan in the Volga region of Russia. The cultural footprint of the Tengriist religion can be seen in modern music, such as the famous Mongolian band The Who, and the indigenous Siberian folk band Orkhon from Russia. Thus, while Tengriism is not a major world religion today, it survives in the cultural memory of Turkic cultures throughout the world. It has been months since her visit to Orkhon, and Sultanat was riding on her horse across the Kazakh steppes. She had led her tribe to the Caspian Sea, and it was time to found a new home. Alongside her were her friends, Guliz, Zemfira and Dostan. Together they raised a totem to their many gods. As the sun was setting and the stars began to shine under the full moon, they began to chant in hopes of their new home becoming bountiful and permanent. For the Turkic peoples, this was the essence of their old Tengriist faith. In the endless emerald fields of the steppes, where the roads were long and endless, the sapphire skies were often where they could find solace. Their many gods and spirits, managing their lives, were a means of spiritual and intellectual cultivation. This faith is intertwined with the roots of Turkic history, and with its original environment. And it is as fascinating as the endless sky where Tengri resides. More videos on the lesser-known religions of world history are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.